Welcome to Finding Forgiveness, a family fairy tale podcast. Join host Susan Gibson as she summons the courage to ask the hard questions, probes deep, dark secrets, and attempts to fill in the gaps while exploring the relationship between her and her mother. Discover the magic of self-discovery, relationship exploration, and the profound journey of forgiveness. Now, your host, Susan Gibson.
Have you ever examined another person's life in parallel with your own? Perhaps it's someone you're working towards forgiveness with. When I was in therapy for the year following my mother's death, my therapist, who was a Jungian psychotherapist and psychiatrist, had me create a timeline of major events in my mother's life. She then asked me to map my major life events on top of my mother's. This was a simple and remarkable activity because it allowed me to see our lives in parallel. Some events we shared, my birth, my parents' divorce, but most were completely separate. This gave me a way to see my mother as separate from me. She was a woman in her own right, not only my mother, but also a professional. She was an accountant for her entire professional career. She was a wife, a sister, a daughter, an aunt, a cousin, a lover, a friend, and more. I have this quote that I really love from Galit Atlas from her book Emotional Inheritance. She says, "Our parents live inside us without our permission. When we are ready to unpack our inheritance, we are able to confront the ghosts we carry within." What is the life in parallel? What is that emotional inheritance that I got from my mother as she's living inside of me? The first is fear. We both started our lives with the fear of survival. Somehow I think this fear that came with our birth honed a deep alignment with our intuition. It's something that's informed and formed us before we had consciousness of thought or action or words to describe what we know and feel. We let the universe be our guide. And my mother lived that way as well. And through the actions and words that we have lived our lives, that serendipity, that being open to what the universe is trying to tell us and guide us has been paramount in how we've lived our lives. It's come in the form of dreams and nightmares as well. And my mother hasn't shared a lot about her dreams and nightmares, but the ones that she has, she had this recurring theme of death in her dreams and nightmares. And sometimes it was the death of somebody close to her. And she always felt that was like an omen. However, through the work that I've done and all the transformation work that I've done, what I've learned is that death in dreams, it's not literal. However, it is your unconscious communicating to you about your own transformation. I've had dreams and nightmares where my life was threatened and where I was close to death or have even died. And it's not me dying, but there's a part of me that is changing and transforming into a new being. And my mother shared this as well. And the unconscious tells us a lot when we are dreaming, and whether they're happy dreams or nightmares, so telling us a lot. And being in touch with that at that deeper level, I do believe that, that it is telling us something. And that fear that we experience is coming from that kind of a moment of survival, if you will, and that moment of transformation that happens with all of us, actually. You know? And that any kind of transformation has fear associated with it. And so being in that consciousness, that awareness of that fear, not letting it have the power over us, not letting it have a paralysis that could come in to say we're not going to do something because we're fearful. No. We acknowledge that fear and we go forward, letting that universe guide us into what is coming next for us, guide us into the unknown, which is very, very fearful. Another aspect of this, and I do believe it's connected to that fear of survival from our birth, is my mother and I share a very deep connection to our ancestors. Not only the people, but the place of our ancestors. We both share this very, very deeply. And I do believe that it comes, like I say, from that initial fear of survival, that in those moments we were surrounded by our ancestors that got us through those initial fearful moments of our birth and the survival that ensued. The love of my parents, mother and father, the love of my mother's parents, my grandparents. It has that deep, deep connection that has been rooted in both of us to place and people of our ancestors. The second is courage. I've spent the better part of my professional career coaching people and organizations through transformations. I always say, it takes a lot of courage to do something different, something outside the norms that have defined our way of being and doing, outside of the conditioning that we've experienced, whether it's the conditioning of working within an organization or the conditioning of society and community, the conditioning of our family's influence. It takes a lot of courage to break out of that. It's also a lot easier to see courage in others than in ourselves. And if I take a look at my mother's courage, leaving a failed marriage is an act of courage. She and I share that. You're going to be judged. You're going to be scrutinized. You're going to find out who's your ally and who's your foe and who's left standing around you to give you love, support, and energy to move through this courageous act into the unknown. And, one thing I found out about my mother, another act of courage, was that after she passed and I was going through all of her legal documents, I came across her marriage certificate to her second husband, Ed. And the date was 1986. And I was just in shock. I was in shock. I mean, this was a deeply held secret that she had. I was under the impression that they got married in 1977 when I moved back in with my mother in my before starting my sophomore year of high school. I mean, I'm still quite blown away by this, quite frankly. They appeared to the world as husband and wife. My mother changed her last name. She went by Mrs. Crawford. Of course, wearing wedding ring. They appeared to the world as husband and wife. And they weren't until 1986. And when I came across this, And I asked my mother's cousin, who was her best friend as well, if he knew. And he said, yes, he did. He did know. And then I asked my best friend, my best childhood friend, if she knew. And she said, yeah, it had come up at some point. And I thought, okay, so I'm the one who didn't know. And when I think about that, especially around the theme of courage, they were living in a small rural community, already deeply judged by having an affair. Both were leaving failed marriages. Both of them had children. And somewhere in there, the choice was to appear as a married couple or to live together and not get married. And I know my mother had asked me what I preferred, and I said I did prefer if they got married. And so to the world they did. Quite remarkable, actually. Quite a charade, for sure, but also quite remarkable to take on this persona of husband and wife deeply. I mean, it was deep into their charade. And what I actually realized throughout all of this, and getting into this story around my mother and this time in our life together, our parallel lives, there are lost years there. There's 6 years that were lost. And in leading up to that, she moved to West Virginia with her second quote unquote husband. And something happened to her during those years. That, she abandoned me, but even more than that. And I've tried to explore what happened to her, but unfortunately, anybody who would have known and been involved with her in West Virginia are no longer alive or unreachable. But I do know that she left her second quote unquote husband, again, quote unquote, and left that life in West Virginia not long after I reconnected with her. And when she did that, she was very broken. Again, told through her cousin, who is very, very near and dear to her, because she chose to move to South Florida because he was there. Her cousin was there. That's where she fled to. And he told me after she died that when she got there, she was not the woman that he knew. She was just beaten down. She could barely speak. She had no means of her own. She had no money of her own. She had a suitcase. And what an act of courage to leave that environment and start a new life. That life did involve her second husband. He did follow her to South Florida, and they got married shortly thereafter. That was a choice of hers. And not knowing all of the other drama that was going on and all the other situations that she had lived through, and thinking they were already married. Of course, there was that was a secondary scenario that she was living. But in the end, I'm actually thankful that they were married. And I'm thankful that they didn't divorce, so they separated not too long after they got married and started living their own separate lives, still in the same community, but separate lives. But when he did die suddenly of a heart attack, she was able to get the financial support by being his wife and being his widow. And I am thankful for that. That she was able to get that extra assistance from him in a odd kind of way, maybe, but I am thankful for that. But incredible acts of courage. when I look at my own life in terms of courage, I mentioned, leaving a failed marriage. I've spent a better part of my adult life traveling for work and for pleasure, but a lot of travel for work. And I had a friend one time tell me, she said, "Susan, you're very courageous to be traveling the world by yourself." I didn't think of it as courageous, but as I've gotten older and kind of, I think, have a different view of the world than I did in those early days of traveling for work around the world, I do see the courage in that. You're out there among strangers. You have access to certain means, but not necessarily uh, access to readily available services and support. And being alone like that, there is a vulnerability to that, traveling all by yourself. I never saw it that way, but those were her words to say that was an act of courage. And I would say this podcast for me is an act of courage. Sharing these stories, sharing my family fairy tale, it does give me a bit of a flutter every time one goes live. That, here's another piece of me. I'm opening up my vulnerability to the world, to all of you, to you who are listening. And I do feel courageous in doing this. Strength is the third area. And years ago, 2013 to be exact, I went home to northern Maine for a visit. A year earlier, I'd started my massive transformation project on my grandmother's house that I own. And it had taken on a life of its own at that point, taking me in directions I hadn't even dreamed of. And on this trip in 2013, I visited my grandmother's grave in the community cemetery. It wasn't something I did often in those years. I do now. But in those years, I didn't go to the cemetery very often. And standing at the top of the hill near my grandmother's grave, surrounded by my ancestors, I closed my eyes. The sun was warm that day. I had my face turned towards the sun. There was a light breeze blowing. My hair was fluttering. And I just let that wash over me. It just cleared my mind. And when I opened my eyes, the words strong and determined flashed before me. And that's how I see my mother. That's how I see myself. We are survivors. There's a strength stretching all the way back in our ancestral line. We have a pioneer spirit and explorer's mind. We move into the unknown because that's the only way to move forward. My mother lived a life of extreme pain for the better part of her life, actually. And due to a rheumatoid arthritis and osteoarthritis and congestive heart failure. And she had such a strength through all of that, such a positivity, such an optimism. I believe that strength actually gave her that will to be grateful every single day. She was never pain-free. Once the rheumatoid arthritis started, she'd never had another day that was pain-free. But she always said, I'm okay. I'm okay. All the way through to the end of her days, she was okay. And, that others kind of saw her, especially in her later years, because she became very frail, very small and thin. But my goodness, she was of strong mind and strong will. And I would tell doctors or EMT professionals or people that work come in contact with her for the first time and see this frail little old woman, and I would tell them, she's stronger than she looks. And, she's in full charge. Let's just be clear. She's in full charge and very much in control of herself and what she wanted every day of her life to look like. And for as long as I can remember, my mother would talk about me to others while I was within earshot. Most of the time, she spoke about me in whispers, somewhat conspiratorially. She would say things in this way without directly talking to me. It was a weird way to communicate, but what I've realized after all these years is that this was a form of communication from her to me. However, I have to say most of the time it irritated me. And, I would yell out, I can hear you. I know she knew I could hear her. This was part of the game that she played, part of the persona that she had with me. And on one of these occasions, Mom told a visitor, if there's a hard way to do something, that's what Susan will pick. I don't know exactly what she meant by that because, she and I never talked about it. But somehow I think she was saying that I'm strong and determined, which I am. As part of this strength, she and I have great resilience and persevering. We persevere through it all. The good, the bad, the happy, the sad. That's the only way forward for us. And the fourth is love. I read a lot. And I came across this quote in a newsletter that I received from Soren. Approach our life as a love affair. I love this quote. I'd never thought about framing my life as a love affair. And ever since I've read this, which hasn't been that long ago, it's been within the past 2 years, approaching your life as a love affair, that's amazing. Love isn't a straight line, nor is it all rainbows and unicorns. It's a deep feeling that can bring incredible joy and elation and paralyzing hurt and despair. When you Google what is love and you scroll past the first result, which is a song from 1993 by Hathaway, you get the dictionary definition. A quality or feeling of strong or constant affection for and dedication to another. And then example is mother's love. There's a bond with the mother, no matter your definition of mother. As hard as it may be to see clearly at times, that bond is love, the original love. Throughout all these years with my mother and all that we went through together and apart, that bond of love is what kept us trying, what kept us continuing to seek understanding, to seek acceptance from one another. It wasn't only me trying to find my mother all those years. She was also trying to find me. That's what brought us together in forgiveness. It was both of us living our lives separately yet in parallel. Both of us being identical in ways and intentional in our own way to be together. Both of us allowing ourselves to be fearful, courageous, and strong. That's what brought us together in 1986. That's what brought us to forgiveness in 2012. That's what brought us to the final moments of a life in parallel in 2021. Love. I'm grateful for our life in parallel. What's that exploration of a life in parallel that you'd like to do with another? I'd love to hear it. You can email me at hellosusan@findingforgivenesspodcast.com. Thank you for being with me today and listening to my podcast, Finding Forgiveness, a Family Fairy Tale. I welcome your comments. A big thank you to the team at Produce Your Podcast for helping me share my family fairy tale. Until next time, I'm Susan Gibson, signing off with gratitude and appreciation.
Thank you for listening to Finding Forgiveness, a family fairy tale podcast. To continue the conversation, visit findingforgivenesspodcast.com and send an email to hellosusan@findingforgivenesspodcast.com to share your story. Until we meet again.